As the war in Ukraine now approaches the end of its first week, many people are wondering, how long can the Ukraine forces hold out? And can Russia correct its initial deficiencies and close in on Ukraine? Even as we speak, there's a 60-kilometer long armored column north of the city that appears poised to strike at any time. Now, the news has been filled with all kinds of reports of Ukrainian heroism, of extraordinary feats of bravery shown by President Zelensky and many of the people of Ukraine standing up in the face of this Russian onslaught. And certainly that is to be congratulated, and it's really something to see, and it's pretty amazing given the circumstances. But when we're talking about what's going to be responsible for winning or losing a war, we have to sometimes take the cold, hard look at combat reality. And right now, despite what many Western commentators want to portray, the situation for Ukraine is grave and getting worse by the hour. And if something doesn't happen, and by that I mean a negotiated settlement, the chances are getting higher and higher that a armored assault on the city of Kyiv ends up taking the war completely into its darkest era, from which Ukraine probably cannot survive. Now, I know that's upsetting to many people, and as I've been on numerous television shows here recently, and have gotten lots of pushback from some of the other commentators and other guests, unfortunately, this is playing out as combat realities and the principles of war assess that it should, assess that it will. And let me just stop and say, I want to make absolutely clear that this war is one person's fault and one person's only, and that is Vladimir Putin. He alone bears the responsibility for the immorality of this war, for the unjustified attack into Kyiv, and all of the destruction and death that has followed is unambiguously his fault, and all of the responsibility falls upon his shoulders. Now, concurrent with that, though, what we in the West have to do is say, what is the best reaction to all of this that we can have here? And what should we do given these horrific, immoral realities coming out of Moscow? And I'll tell you, unequivocally, the absolute most important core requirement for West right now is to make sure this stays contained in Ukraine and does not expand beyond it. We saw a week before the war started that Putin personally oversaw a nuclear triad exercise where he physically demonstrated and exercised his capabilities for firing nuclear weapons as a barely disguised warning to the West. Now, days into the war, he has physically raised the warning level up to its highest level in Russia, accelerating or accentuating the risk to the West. Now, we cannot just dismiss that as bluster, because the last thing we need to do is push Putin too hard and try to impose too many penalties on him, that he gets feels like he's boxed in a corner, that gets desperate, because a desperate man whose finger is hovering above a nuclear launch code and launch button is something that could have catastrophic implications for all of mankind, not just Ukraine, not just Russia, not even just the West. This could have catastrophe for mankind, and we have to be smart and wise about how we proceed here. Because the natural inclination is to want to just put as much penalty and much pain on Vladimir Putin as possible, and even if some have suggested possibly setting up a no-fly zone over Kyiv, possibly moving towards regime change pressures on Putin. Now, these may sound good in isolation, but if they make Putin feel like he is being threatened and the walls are closing in around him from around the world, then the risk comes to him that he might be tempted to think maybe a tactical nuke is something that I can use to reset the conditions to where I will forestall the worst of the things that could come to me. That would be catastrophic, because the whole thing about mutually assured destruction is just as effective now as it was in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And we are foolish if we think that we can get by with that by putting that pressure on him and hoping that he doesn't. Now, what we should be doing is doing everything possible diplomatically to end the fighting as soon as possible. As I pointed out here, and as the Russian armor that's advancing in multiple areas around Ukraine, on multiple axes, they're continuing to move forward, even with the horrible missteps that they had, even with the great heroic actions of many Ukrainians. Heroism doesn't stop a Russian tank, and we just have to be cognizant of that, and we just have to be willing to recognize that's just the reality of it. What we should be doing instead is doing everything in our power, both privately in diplomacy, even through back channels to Moscow, and through our direct channels to Zelensky, to encourage him to find the fastest way to get a negotiated settlement to end the fighting. Now, because of this unprecedented level of global attacks and global pressure on Putin, especially with all these sanctions, and I mean, it's across the board. It's not just economic. It's not even just the West. It is a global pressure on Putin, which he vastly underestimated, and I don't think he had any idea this was coming. Now, that can play to our advantage, though, and to Zelensky's advantage, because if he can negotiate in the tactical level within Ukraine and into the war, and he can do that by declaring neutrality. He can do it by saying that NATO's never come in. We can help by saying that we will put an indefinite moratorium on NATO membership for Ukraine. If we have to eat a little pride, that's okay. If that ends the fighting and ends the death for these brave, proud Ukrainians, that's a price that we should pay. And I know it's not popular, but it's the right move, and that's what we should do. Because the first course of action, the first one, is to end the fighting, end the killing. Now, once we have that established, now that because of this enormous pressure around the globe, there's a lot of leverage for the West, for Zelensky, to continue to negotiate things back, to maybe get the Donbas back even. I don't think the Crimea is ever going to come back. I think that's a bridge too far, and it's just never going to happen. But the Donbas is still not solidified, and that is a possibility. But look, if we say no, we're going to hold out for maximalist gains. We're going to hold out that Zelensky ends up winning. The chances are almost nil that happens. And by holding out for that, by encouraging Ukraine to fight for that, we basically, the chances are great that we condemn them to a military defeat. Now he has no negotiating position. Now thousands of Ukrainians could be dead that otherwise wouldn't. And that is why right now, while we still have a chance, we need to stop this war today.